Please enjoy this preview of the Truth and Other Lies presentation of LHO versus JFK, the final analysis. Welcome back to LHO versus JFK, Warren's Folly. Before we get back to the Warren Commission, let's talk about the real-world consequences of those 3 days.
During that weekend, 3 people were murdered. 3 women lost their husbands, and 7 children lost their fathers, including 1-month-old Rachel Oswald. Marina Oswald and Marie Tippett would raise their children as single mothers in a time when that was much more difficult than today, both socially and economically.
Just because we allow humor into the discourse doesn't mean that we take this material lightly. Just the opposite. It can be very dark, and humor lightens the mood and allows somber and sometimes tedious information to be delivered in a way that is easier to process. James, we know the Warren Commission at first resisted the FBI's,
and by FBI, we mean full-time extortionist J. Edgar Hoover.
The FBI's insistence that Lee Oswald acted alone and no further investigation was necessary or warranted, pun intended. But it seems that the Commission never strayed very far from the Oswald narrative. From February 1964 onward, the Commission seems to have accepted, even if begrudgingly, the Oswald lone gunman conclusion.
And yet the Warren Report does a very poor job of framing a guilty man.
Guilty or not, one would think that a team of 15 lawyers, led by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, could publish an airtight indictment of their chosen victim. It did not. The Warren Report has 879 pages, but the first hole in the case appears on page 19.
And I quote, "Although it is not necessary to any essential findings of the Commission to determine just which shot hit Governor Connally, there is very persuasive evidence from the experts to indicate the same bullet which pierced the president's throat also caused Connally's wounds." Close quote.
Governor of Texas John Connally was seated in front of President Kennedy in the limousine and received wounds in his back, right wrist, and left thigh. The Warren Report attributed all of these wounds to a single bullet, passing through Connally's torso, then his wrist, and finally striking his thigh. James, why is it important to know which bullet hit Governor Connally?
Because if you don't know which bullet hit Connally, and you don't know how many shots were fired, if you don't know that, you can't know how many shooters there were.
And if you don't know how many shooters there were, you cannot rule out a conspiracy.
And if you cannot rule out a conspiracy, then the prospect of nuclear war with the Soviet Union becomes as real as it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis 1 year earlier.
That is strike number 1 against the Warren Commission. It failed to grasp the importance of the wounds to Governor Connally. The Commission's next failure was its inability to identify the elements of the crime, specifically to establish the elements in sequence and without physical or logical conflict. Evidence and testimony that did not fit neatly into the box of Oswald did it was patronizingly dismissed or simply ignored. 5 witnesses smelled gunpowder at street level. 3 witnesses saw a bullet strike the pavement behind the limousine, challenging the Commission's sequence of shots.
The Commission waffles on the sequence of shots, but its summary assumes that the first shot struck the president's back or neck, the second shot missed, and the third shot struck the president in the head.
Secret Service Assistant Special Agent in Charge, Roy Kellerman, seated next to the driver of the president's limousine, said he heard the president say, "My God, I've been hit."
Thus, the Warren Report has the president speaking through a ruptured trachea, which would not be possible. Medical experts also assert that the president would have been paralyzed, at least temporarily, because of the shock to the spinal cord.
Let's repeat that slowly. According to the Warren Report, the president spoke to ASAC Roy Kellerman after having his trachea blown out by a bullet. This occurs on page 50 of the Warren Report.
Strike 2 against the Warren Commission.
Strike 2 against the Warren Commission, speaking through a ruptured trachea. Guess how many pages until strike 3?
The next page?
Very close. From page 50, we turn 2 leaves and arrive at page 54, where the Warren Report completely and entirely mutilates its raison d'etre. Way back on page 18, the Warren Report states clearly that Kennedy was killed by shots fired from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building. Concluding that President Kennedy was killed by shots from the TSBD building means that all 3 shots came from behind. Is that clear?
All 3 shots originated behind the president.
Something else that we should understand is that 99% of the time, a bullet will create a smaller entrance wound than exit wound. The entrance wound will generally be in the size and shape of the cross-section of the bullet, and the exit wound will be a large, ragged avulsion due to attitude changes and/or deformation of the bullet. Attitude change, also called yaw, means that the nose of the bullet is no longer pointed in the direction of travel and may be traveling sideways. Coming back to page 54, let's see what Parkland Memorial Hospital Chief Neurologist Dr. William Kemp Clark had to say about the president's wounds, according to the Warren Report.
Quote, Dr. Clark, who most closely observed the head wound, described a large, gaping wound in the right rear part of the head, with substantial damage and exposure of brain tissue, and a considerable loss of blood. Dr. Clark did not see any other hole or wound on the president's head. Close quote.
Wait, it's only the first episode and I'm getting confused. Could you say that again into my good ear?
Dr. Clark, who most closely observed the head wound, described a large gaping wound in the right rear part of the head.
James, what have we established about gunshot wounds?
That the exit is bigger than the entrance.
And what did the Warren Report say about the origin of the shots?
They came from behind.
They came from behind. That's exactly what Gold 5 said right before he bought it while attacking the Death Star. And nobody has ever said he was shot from the front.
But then Gold 5 wasn't autopsied at Bethesda Naval Hospital. What about Kennedy?
Who? Sorry, I was thinking that there was no way that Luke made that shot on the Death Star. There must have been someone on the wall of the trench that launched that fatal torpedo.
Well, what happened in this galaxy?
In this galaxy, the Warren Report implied that President Kennedy was shot from the front, invalidating its primary conclusion and turning the entire volume into a boat anchor.
Let's say that again for effect. The Warren Report implied President Kennedy was shot from the front, invalidating its primary conclusion.
Did we just become conspiracy theorists?
No, because the government said the shot came from the front. We didn't.
And the government never lies or makes mistakes.
Except for those lies we listed at the beginning.
Except for those, right.
Mark, there is something that concerns me, though. I hesitate to mention it, but did you know some JFK assassination researchers take facts out of context to support their own specious conclusions? How do we know that on the very next line, the commission didn't reconcile this apparent contradiction?
How do we know indeed? On the screen right now is a picture of pages 54 and 55 with Dr. Clark's statement highlighted. We'll pause the audio for the reader to view the pages and draw their own conclusions. And now that our erudite audience has sated their curiosity, James, what is the third strike?
Contradicting its primary conclusion by implying an exit wound in the back of the head.
Strike 3 against the Warren Report, contradicting its primary conclusion.
Does that mean we're done?
Nope, we have several more strikes to go.
But there are only 3 strikes in baseball.
This isn't baseball, it's government. They get to swing away. James, to recap, strike 1 is
Failure to understand the importance of Connolly's wounds.
Strike 2.
President Kennedy speaking through a ruptured trachea.
Strike 3.
Contradicting its primary conclusion by implying an exit wound in the back of the head.
Let's take a break and come back with more Warren's Folly. You have been listening to a preview of LHO versus JFK, the final analysis. Subscribe to this channel to be notified when the full episode is available later this month.